In every courtroom, justice is supposed to be blind. But what happens when the system itself fails to see beyond the color of one's skin? In a small-town courthouse in Greenville, South Carolina, a powerful story unfolds, one that reveals the uncomfortable truth about racial bias in the legal system. This is the story of Kendrick Robinson, a distinguished federal prosecutor who, on one fateful morning, faces a stark and unfair punishment simply because of the color of his skin. Kendrick had just arrived late to a routine municipal court session, a minor setback but one that would change the course of his day and his life. As a federal prosecutor, his mornings were always planned down to the last minute, but today the unexpected had thrown him off course. Little did he know, the judge presiding over the courtroom, Judge Charles Whitman, was no ordinary judge. Known for his harsh approach and rigid adherence to order, Whitman had a reputation that caused even seasoned attorneys to tread lightly. What began as a simple case about a property tax adjustment quickly escalated into something much larger, an examination of systemic racial bias concealed under the guise of judicial authority. As Kendrick stood before the judge, his professionalism and years of experience didn't shield him from the subtle yet unmistakable difference in how he was treated compared to others in the courtroom. The fine that was imposed on him for tardiness was not just an isolated incident. It was a glaring example of the prejudice that often lurks in the legal system, unnoticed by many, but felt deeply by those who endure it. This story is about more than just one man's struggle against a biased judge. It's a call to action, a reminder that we must continue to fight for fairness and equality in every aspect of our society. Kendrick's stand against the systemic racism he witnessed that day is a testament to the power of standing up, even when the odds seem insurmountable. If you believe in justice and equality, please hit that subscribe button. Your support helps amplify voices like Kendrick's, and together, we can continue to expose the biases that still exist within our systems. Kendrick Robinson had always prided himself on being punctual, disciplined, and organized. As a federal prosecutor, his entire professional life was built on the foundation of precision and preparedness. Every move, every step, was calculated to ensure that justice was served and that his cases were presented with the utmost integrity. His reputation as a sharp, meticulous lawyer preceded him, and he was respected by colleagues and adversaries alike. But today, everything seemed to be conspiring against him. The clock on the dashboard of his car read 8:42 a.m. as Kendrick parked in the lot outside the municipal courthouse in Greenville, South Carolina. The morning sunlight streamed through the windshield, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. Kendrick exhaled deeply, rubbing his temples as the weight of his late arrival began to settle in. This wasn't supposed to be complicated. His day was supposed to be straightforward, routine even. He was here to challenge an error in a property tax adjustment on the house his grandmother had left him. A simple matter, really. The city had inexplicably raised the taxes on the property, and Kendrick had spent the past few weeks gathering evidence to prove it was a mistake. For Kendrick, this house was more than just property. It was a symbol of his childhood, the place where he had been raised by his grandmother, the one person who had always been there for him, teaching him the importance of hard work, integrity, and standing up for what was right. But, as life often does, the morning had thrown a wrench into his plans. A last-minute phone call about an ongoing federal case had set him back. The defense team had filed a motion, and Kendrick couldn't ignore it. Human trafficking cases were always urgent, always demanding immediate attention. He had reviewed the motion, provided feedback to his team, and rushed out the door. No time for coffee, no time to grab a quick bite. Just the sound of his hurried footsteps echoing in the empty halls of his office as he tried to make it to court in time. Despite the delay, Kendrick had hoped he'd still make it. After all, his case was important, and he had the evidence to back it up. Yet, as he stepped out of his car and glanced at the courthouse, the familiar feeling of dread settled over him. He wasn't late yet, but he was cutting it close. His phone buzzed. It was a message from his assistant at the U.S. Attorney's Office. "The judge in Greenville has a reputation for being tough on latecomers. Be careful." Kendrick sighed, the tension in his chest tightening. He wasn't worried about the case. It was solid. Facts were his weapon, and he always came prepared. But something about the message lingered in his mind. He had worked with judges who were tough but fair. But something about this judge, something in the way the message was worded, felt different. As he walked up the courthouse steps, he could feel his heart rate quicken. 10 minutes. That's all the time he had. Just 10 minutes to find the right courtroom, set his papers in order, and calm his nerves before facing whatever lay ahead. The thought of being late, of showing up in front of a judge who valued punctuality above all else, made his stomach churn. Yet, despite all the tension, Kendrick remained composed. This was just another case, another day in the life of a seasoned prosecutor. Or so he told himself. But deep down, he knew that today might not be like every other day. With each step toward the door, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that things were about to take a turn. The courthouse in Greenville wasn't much to look at. Its worn walls and faded paint whispered of decades of use. The beige paint on the walls seemed to absorb the muted conversations and the shuffle of shoes across the old wooden floors. Despite its unremarkable exterior, the courthouse hummed with a constant buzz of activity. People were filing in and out of various courtrooms carrying stacks of papers, some with looks of determination, others with expressions of quiet resignation. The smell of old coffee and paper lingered in the air, mixing with the faint sounds of murmurs and whispers. Kendrick felt an uneasy stillness in the air as he stepped inside. This wasn't like the federal courts he was used to. Immaculate, high-tech, where every detail was scrutinized and every decision made with the utmost precision. This was different. The municipal court had a distinct atmosphere, one that seemed to radiate a sense of disorder. Old, tired, and seemingly forgotten by the more polished courts. The hallways were narrow, the ceiling low. The sound of his footsteps echoed as he made his way toward room 204, the door of which was etched with the name Judge Charles Whitman. Kendrick adjusted his tie, took a deep breath, and entered. As he stepped inside the courtroom, the shift in energy was palpable. People filled the seats in hushed silence, most of them dressed in casual clothing, anxiously awaiting their turn in front of the judge. The air felt thick with tension, the hum of conversation quickly dissipating as Kendrick made his way to the back. The room had an old-world feel, with its creaky chairs and rows of worn-out wooden pews. Despite its aged appearance, the space had an undeniable presence. It was a place where decisions were made, where lives could change in an instant. And then there was the judge. Judge Charles Whitman walked into the room with an air of authority that instantly commanded attention. Tall and imposing, his presence filled the courtroom even before he took his seat. His hair, silver and neatly combed, gave him an air of dignity, though it did little to soften the sharpness of his piercing blue eyes. Kendrick couldn't help but notice how the judge's gaze seemed to cut through the room, scanning the crowd with a calculating precision. There was no room for hesitation, no tolerance for weakness. As the judge settled into his chair, the room fell into a tense silence. Kendrick knew that look well. It was the gaze of someone who had seen it all, who held the power to make or break someone's day with a simple gavel strike. Judge Whitman didn't need to raise his voice. The way he looked at people was enough to instill fear and respect. His reputation preceded him, known for his unwavering adherence to order and his intolerance for those who didn't meet his strict expectations. Kendrick couldn't shake the feeling that this would be no ordinary court appearance. The stories he'd heard about Judge Whitman were true. He was tough, unyielding, and had a reputation for punishing even the smallest infractions. But Kendrick had always prided himself on being prepared, on walking into any courtroom ready for whatever came his way. And yet there was something about this judge, something about the way he carried himself, that made Kendrick uneasy. It wasn't just the judge's stern demeanor. It was the authority in his eyes, the way the room seemed to bend around him as if he was the absolute arbiter of truth. Kendrick had faced tough judges before, but this felt different, like he was walking into a lion's den. The air in the room grew heavier as the proceedings began, and Kendrick could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, even as he tried to settle into his seat. The day ahead was about to become something Kendrick hadn't prepared for. The courtroom had settled into a tense rhythm as Judge Whitman began calling cases one by one, his voice sharp and commanding. Kendrick sat in the back, silently reviewing his evidence. Despite the lingering unease, he focused on the task at hand, the property tax adjustment case. He had prepared meticulously, gathered his evidence, and now all he had to do was present it clearly and confidently. But something about the atmosphere felt off. Kendrick couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing beneath the surface. As the judge worked his way through the cases, Kendrick noticed the behavior around him. People shuffled in and out of the courtroom, some arriving late, others presenting their cases with little more than a brief exchange. The judge's tone was efficient, impersonal, but fair. At least, it seemed that way. It wasn't until 9:15 a.m. when Kendrick's name was finally called. He stood, adjusting his tie and grabbing his folder, ready to present his case. With calm deliberation, he walked to the podium, his heart racing just a little, though his face remained composed. But the moment he stepped up, the tension in the air shifted. Judge Whitman's eyes locked onto Kendrick, the sharpness in his gaze unmistakable. The judge's expression hardened as he scanned Kendrick from head to toe. The room fell silent, the eyes of everyone in the courtroom fixed on the exchange that was about to unfold. "Mr. Robinson," Judge Whitman began, his voice cutting through the stillness like a knife. "You're late." Kendrick's stomach tightened. He had expected this. He had been warned, but he hadn't expected the severity with which the judge would address the issue. It wasn't just the reprimand. It was the tone, the way it felt like the words were meant to pierce through him. "I apologize, Your Honor," Kendrick began, his voice steady. "I was delayed due to urgent federal matters. A human trafficking case requires immediate attention." Judge Whitman didn't allow him to finish. His hand came down sharply on the gavel, silencing Kendrick and the room at large. "Excuses don't excuse tardiness," the judge snapped, his voice sharp as ever. "This court operates on order and respect. If you can't manage that, I suggest you reconsider your priorities." Kendrick felt his jaw tighten. He hadn't been disrespectful, not in the slightest. But here, in this room, his explanation meant nothing. The judge's eyes remained cold, unwavering. Kendrick's mind raced. He was a federal prosecutor, one of the highest-ranking officials in the country's legal system. Yet here he was, standing before a judge who seemed to have no interest in understanding his situation. "Your Honor, if I may," Kendrick tried again, keeping his tone calm. "I understand the importance of punctuality, but I ask for your consideration. I would like to present my case regarding the property tax adjustment on my grandmother's house." Judge Whitman waved him off dismissively, his gaze already moving to the next case. "We'll get to that in due time, Mr. Robinson," he said, his tone dripping with indifference. "First, there's the matter of contempt. Tardiness undermines the integrity of these proceedings. You are hereby fined $750. The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, each syllable carrying the weight of a decision that could change Kendrick's day, perhaps even his career. Kendrick's jaw clenched, but his face remained neutral. He had expected a fine, perhaps even reprimands, but not this harshness. The fine was not just for the late arrival, it was a punishment, an example. Around him, the murmurs began. Whispers of disbelief passed through the room as Kendrick took a step back. He could feel the eyes of the other people in the courtroom on him, watching, judging. It was hard not to feel the weight of their scrutiny, but it was even harder not to notice the contrast. In the minutes before, Kendrick had watched as others arrived late, some with far less urgency than he'd experienced. A man in a gray blazer had walked in well after the judge had begun his session, yet the judge had hardly acknowledged him. A young woman, barely dressed in anything formal, had slipped into the room, scrolling on her phone, unnoticed by the judge. But Kendrick? The moment he stepped into the room, the judge's gaze zeroed in on him. The moment his name was called, the tone shifted. This wasn't just about being late. This was about something deeper. Kendrick tried to suppress the feeling that gnawed at him, but it was clear. He was being treated differently. His race, his position, his presence in that courtroom, none of it mattered to Judge Whitman. What mattered was the image Kendrick presented, and how that image seemed to invite a harsher response. This moment wasn't just about one fine. It was about something much larger, something deeper, a system that often treated people of color differently, regardless of their professional stature. As Kendrick stood there, his thoughts were already turning. This wasn't going to end here. If you believe in justice, in fairness, and equality for everyone, please subscribe and support the cause. Together, we can make sure this story, and the countless others like it, doesn't go unheard. Kendrick stood at the podium, his mind racing as Judge Whitman's gavel came down, sealing the fine that had just been imposed on him. The words, $750 for tardiness, echoed in his ears, but it wasn't the amount of the fine that was unsettling. It was the principle behind it. The sharpness of the judge's tone, the coldness with which he'd been reprimanded, the lack of any consideration for the circumstances that had delayed him, it all felt wrong. But as Kendrick stepped back from the podium, something began to settle into his mind. He hadn't been the only one to arrive late. He hadn't been the only one to cause a disruption. Yet he was the only one who had been punished so severely. And that wasn't just an accident. It wasn't a mere coincidence. Kendrick's gut told him that this was about more than just a few minutes of lateness. It was about something far deeper. It was about the way he was being treated, the way he was being singled out, and the way others in the room, who had committed the same crime, faced no consequence at all. The room was quiet as the next case was called. Kendrick took a moment to look around, to pay attention to the other latecomers and their treatment. There, a man in a well-worn gray blazer had shuffled into the room several minutes after the judge began. His steps were slow, almost as if he didn't care that he had arrived late. He slipped into a seat near the front, not so much as a glance from Judge Whitman. The man sat, flipping through papers, preparing to speak. Not a word was said about his lateness. Then there was the young woman who had walked in just before Kendrick, dressed in casual clothes, her phone in hand. She took a seat, scrolling through something, completely oblivious to the proceedings. Judge Whitman didn't even look at her. He didn't acknowledge her tardiness or question her priorities. She, too, was allowed to quietly settle into her seat, completely unbothered. Kendrick's mind was racing. He watched as the next few cases unfolded with the same lack of urgency. The late arrivals were treated with indifference, given the benefit of the doubt, allowed to slip into their seats with little to no reprimand. The judge, despite his earlier harshness, didn't seem to care about their lateness at all. But when Kendrick had arrived, when it had been his turn to face the judge, the room had shifted. The atmosphere had tightened. The judge's gaze had locked onto him, his expression hardening the moment Kendrick walked in. The fine had been swift, severe, and without any real justification. It was as if his mere presence demanded a harsher punishment. That's when it hit Kendrick. This wasn't about tardiness at all. It wasn't about a few minutes here or there. This was about something much deeper. It was about racial bias, about the way the system was stacked against him, even before he had spoken a word. Kendrick was no stranger to bias. As a black man, he had encountered subtle and overt forms of discrimination throughout his life and career. But this was different. This was happening in real time, in a public courtroom where justice was supposed to be blind. And yet, the reality was far from it. The disparities were glaring. He glanced back at the other latecomers, the young woman and the man in the gray blazer. They were white. Their casual arrivals, their lack of urgency, their carelessness, all of it was overlooked by the judge. But Kendrick, a black man dressed in a dark navy suit, who had been rushing through the morning to get to court on time, had been met with hostility and punishment. The fine, the tone, the judge's glaring disapproval. It wasn't just about tardiness. It was about the way Kendrick was seen, the way his worth and his professionalism were immediately questioned simply because of the color of his skin. In that moment, Kendrick realized the stark difference in how he and others were treated, not just in this courtroom, but in the system at large. It was a realization that weighed heavily on him. How many times had people of color been treated differently, not because of their actions, but because of who they were? How many times had they been held to a different standard, forced to prove their worth in a system that already judged them before they had a chance to speak? Kendrick's mind raced as he recalled other instances in his career, other cases where race had played a role in the outcome, though it had been hidden beneath layers of legal jargon and official protocol. But this was different. This wasn't something he could ignore. He had seen the bias. He had felt the sting of it, in the gavel that had come down so quickly, in the way the judge had treated him like he was somehow less worthy, less deserving of respect. As the next cases were called, Kendrick's thoughts lingered on the unfairness of it all. His mind was already making plans, weighing his options. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't let the judge's behavior slide. This wasn't just about him. It was about something much larger. This was about a system that needed to be held accountable. This was about justice for everyone, no matter their race. Kendrick knew that the fight was far from over. As he took his seat again, he made a decision. He would challenge this disparity, this bias. He would make sure that it was seen, that it was known. He couldn't let this moment slip by without action, because if he did, the same treatment would continue, unchallenged and unchecked. If you believe in equality and justice and want to see real change in our system, please subscribe. Your support is the first step in holding the courts accountable and fighting racial bias, one story at a time. Kendrick sat back down in the crowded courtroom, his mind a whirl of thoughts and observations. The $750 fine hung heavily in the air, but it was no longer about the fine itself. It wasn't even about the late arrival or the property tax case he had come to present. No, this was something deeper. The sharp sting of the judge's words, the way they felt like an attack, not just on his professionalism, but on his dignity, had ignited something in him. As he opened the folder before him, the papers seemed to blur for a moment. The weight of what had just transpired was settling in. Kendrick's legal instincts were sharper than ever, and something told him that this moment, this day, wasn't just a blip in his career. This was an opportunity to challenge the very system that had allowed this kind of injustice to continue. The more Kendrick replayed the events in his mind, the clearer it became. There was a pattern here. It wasn't just about being late, it wasn't just about a fine. It was about a system that had allowed racial disparities to fester unchecked, hidden in plain sight. Kendrick wasn't blind to the realities of systemic bias. As a black man, he had seen it before, in different forms, in different places. But this was inescapable, blatant, undeniable. He couldn't ignore the way Judge Whitman had treated him differently from the others in the room. It wasn't just the fine. It was the way the judge had looked at him, the way his presence alone seemed to provoke a harsher reaction. It was the casual disregard for the other latecomers, none of whom had been reprimanded, none of whom had been fined. Kendrick had seen the contrast, and it was impossible to unsee it. The more he thought about it, the more Kendrick realized that this wasn't just an isolated incident. This was part of a larger issue, one that affected not just him, but countless others who had come before him. How many times had people of color been treated with such disregard, such disdain, simply because of the color of their skin? How many times had others been given the benefit of the doubt, while black defendants faced harsher scrutiny, harsher consequences? Kendrick's hand moved quickly across the paper in front of him, jotting down notes. His pen seemed to flow with urgency. He had to document everything. every observation, every moment that had made him question the fairness of the system. His mind was working at full capacity now. He needed evidence. He needed proof. He needed something concrete that would show that the disparities he had witnessed weren't just one-off occurrences. They were part of a larger, more systemic issue. The latecomers, the different treatments they received, the way the judge's behavior seemed to shift the moment Kendrick entered the room. These were the things he needed to capture. Every detail, every nuance. The way the other latecomers had slipped in without so much as a glance from the judge, while Kendrick had been met with hostility. The way the fine had been imposed on him with a severity that seemed out of proportion to the offense. It wasn't just about tardiness. It was about race. It was about power, and Kendrick wasn't going to let it slide. He stopped writing for a moment, letting the gravity of the situation settle in. What he had just witnessed wasn't just personal. This was a problem that reached far beyond him. This was about something bigger, something that needed to be addressed. The thought hit him with clarity. He couldn't stay silent. As a federal prosecutor, he had a responsibility to uphold justice, to ensure that the law was applied fairly, without bias. He had been trained to recognize injustice, to fight for fairness, and to make sure that the truth was heard. And now, the truth was staring him in the face. Kendrick's gaze shifted toward the bench where Judge Whitman sat, oblivious to the storm that was brewing. The judge continued with the proceedings, unaffected by the disruption he had caused, by the injustice he had perpetuated. But Kendrick wasn't going to let this moment go. He couldn't. His mind was already forming the next steps. He would gather the evidence, he would compile the documentation, and he would take action. This was no longer just about one fine or one judge. It was about a pattern, a system, a culture that had allowed racism to take root in places where it should never have existed. Kendrick's decision was made. He would challenge the status quo. He would expose the bias he had witnessed, and he would fight for justice. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about ensuring that the next person who walked into a courtroom, whether black, brown, or white, was treated with fairness, respect, and equality. He wasn't going to stand by while this continued. And so, as the court session continued around him, Kendrick made his plan. He would gather the proof. He would make sure this wasn't swept under the rug. This wasn't just a fight for him. It was a fight for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. And it was a fight Kendrick was determined to win. If you believe in justice, fairness, and equality, hit that subscribe button. Join the fight for a system that treats everyone with the dignity they deserve. Together, we can make a difference. The courtroom had grown quieter as the morning proceedings wore on, the usual hum of activity subdued in the wake of Kendrick's fine. He sat in the back, his eyes focused on the case at hand, but his mind was elsewhere. The reality of what had just happened weighed heavily on him. The fine was more than just an injustice. It was a sign of something much larger, something that he couldn't ignore. Kendrick had been wronged, but more importantly, the system had failed him, and it had failed others before him, too. Kendrick's thoughts were sharp, methodical. He had to act. He couldn't let this moment pass without challenging the bias he had witnessed. He had been patient, but patience had its limits, and Kendrick had reached his. His legal instincts told him that this wasn't a moment he could walk away from. It was a turning point. As the cases continued, Kendrick knew what he had to do. His body was still, but his mind was in motion. He rose from his seat, the weight of the decision pressing on him, his every step deliberate as he walked toward the front of the room. His heart beat steadily, the adrenaline pumping through his veins, but he maintained his composure. This wasn't about emotion. This was about justice. Kendrick's hand rested on the edge of the podium, his eyes steady as he approached Judge Whitman. The judge barely looked up as Kendrick made his way to the front, his gavel resting at his side, almost as if he were waiting for something to happen. The air in the courtroom had shifted. People noticed it. There was an unspoken tension in the room, a palpable sense that something important was unfolding. The moment Kendrick stood at the podium, he introduced himself calmly, his voice firm and unwavering. "Your Honor, I believe it's important that I formally introduce myself," Kendrick began. The courtroom fell silent as Kendrick's words filled the room. "I am Kendrick Robinson, Assistant United States Attorney for the Northern District of South Carolina. I've been serving in this role for over a decade, handling cases related to human trafficking, civil rights violations, and corruption." Judge Whitman's eyes flicked up briefly, his expression unreadable. The words seemed to catch the judge's attention for the briefest of moments, but Kendrick didn't stop. He wasn't here to get the judge's approval. He was here to make sure the truth was heard. "I was late this morning due to an urgent federal case," Kendrick continued, "a human trafficking case. And while I understand the importance of court procedures, I also believe that fairness and equality must be upheld in every courtroom, regardless of who stands before it." There was a stillness in the room now, the kind that always precedes something monumental. Kendrick could feel the weight of every eye in the courtroom. Some were curious, others apprehensive, but Kendrick's focus remained squarely on Judge Whitman. He wasn't just here to explain his lateness. He was here to challenge the very foundation of what had happened earlier. "I was fined $750 this morning for arriving late. Your Honor, I don't take issue with the fine itself, but I do take issue with the manner in which it was imposed," Kendrick said, his voice steady but firm. "It wasn't just a fine for being late. It was the manner in which I was treated. I understand the importance of respecting this court, but I also believe that respect should be mutual. And I can't help but wonder if the severity of my punishment was influenced by something other than my tardiness. I ask you, Your Honor, are these rules applied equally to everyone in this courtroom?" The judge's face stiffened as Kendrick's words hung in the air, the weight of the question settling over the room. The tension in the courtroom was palpable now, the silence stretching as Kendrick stood firm in front of the judge, his calm demeanor belying the seriousness of his challenge. Judge Whitman shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His lips tightened, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Are you questioning the integrity of this court, Mr. Robinson?" His voice was sharp, but Kendrick remained unfazed. "I am not questioning the integrity of the court, Your Honor," Kendrick replied, his tone unwavering. "But I am questioning the way the court applies its rules. I am questioning whether those rules are being used to uphold justice or to perpetuate bias." There was a moment of silence. Kendrick didn't back down. He stood his ground, his posture straight, his resolve clear. This wasn't just about one fine. This was about the way justice was being served, or more accurately, the way it was being denied. Kendrick had seen the disparities. He had felt them, and he wasn't about to let them go unchecked. The judge's expression hardened, but Kendrick was undeterred. He had made his point, and now it was up to the system to respond. "Your Honor," Kendrick said, his voice clear and firm, "I've been a prosecutor for years, and I've seen bias in all forms. But I cannot stand by and allow it to continue, especially in a place where justice is supposed to reign. I intend to take this further. This is not just about one individual. It's about ensuring that the principles of fairness and equality are upheld in every courtroom. And that, Your Honor, starts here. If you believe in standing up against injustice and fighting for a fair legal system for all, please subscribe. Your support is crucial in bringing these stories to light and ensuring that change happens. Together, we can make sure that every person, regardless of race, is treated with fairness and dignity in the courtroom. Kendrick didn't walk away from the courtroom that morning feeling like he had won. He knew this was only the beginning. As a federal prosecutor, Kendrick understood that justice wasn't always immediate, and it certainly wasn't always easy. But it was something worth fighting for, no matter the cost. And today, the cost would be the very thing he had feared most, challenging the authority of a judge who had the power to make or break careers, not to mention lives. The moment he had stood before Judge Whitman and made his accusations, Kendrick knew the stakes were high. This wasn't just about one man's fine or one instance of racial bias. It was about exposing the deep, systemic issues that had infected the very core of the legal system. The law was supposed to be blind, but Kendrick had seen firsthand how it favored one group over another, how certain faces were treated differently from others. He had heard the stories, he had read the reports, but now he was experiencing it himself. Standing in front of the judge, Kendrick's voice had been calm, but the words he spoke were anything but. "Are these rules applied equally to everyone in this courtroom?" Kendrick had asked, looking directly into the judge's eyes. It wasn't a rhetorical question. It was a challenge. It was a moment of clarity, where Kendrick had realized he couldn't stay silent. This was about far more than just his own personal treatment. It was about a courtroom that had lost sight of the very principles it was meant to uphold. The judge's reaction was immediate. His face reddened, his posture stiffened, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Judge Whitman had built a reputation for being unyielding, for maintaining control at all costs. Kendrick's question had been a direct assault on that control. The judge's words came quickly, his tone laced with an unmistakable air of indignation. "Are you questioning the integrity of this court, Mr. Robinson?" Judge Whitman had snapped, his voice cutting through the silence of the courtroom. Kendrick didn't flinch. He stood firm, knowing that what he was about to say wasn't just for him. It was for everyone who had been silenced by a system that failed them. "I'm not questioning the integrity of the court, Your Honor," Kendrick replied, his voice unwavering. "But I am questioning the way the court applies its rules. I'm questioning whether fairness is applied equally to everyone here." The words hung in the air, charged with the weight of everything Kendrick had witnessed, everything he had fought for, and everything he was willing to continue fighting for. The judge had stiffened further, clearly uncomfortable, but Kendrick was undeterred. He knew this wasn't the kind of moment that would end with one exchange, one confrontation. But what Kendrick also knew was that moments like this were how real change began. Standing up to authority, even when it felt uncomfortable or dangerous, was the only way to challenge the systems that upheld bias and injustice. And Kendrick wasn't done. He knew that the fine had been just a small piece of the puzzle. It wasn't about the money. It was about what it represented. A system that punished him, not because of his tardiness, but because of his race. It wasn't just about one moment. It was about the broader system of discrimination that he had seen time and time again, hidden under the guise of order and respect. Kendrick's actions didn't just expose a singular act of bias, it sparked a movement. His decision to challenge the judge's authority wasn't just about him standing up for himself, it was about standing up for every person who had been treated unfairly by a legal system that had long been blind to its own biases. Kendrick had set a precedent. He had shown that no one, no matter their position or status, was beyond the reach of accountability. This fight wasn't just about one man or one courtroom. It was about ensuring that every person, regardless of race, had access to the fairness and justice they deserved. And Kendrick's stand was a call to action for everyone who believed in a truly equitable system. If you believe that standing up against injustice is the first step in dismantling systemic racism, please subscribe. Your support helps amplify these voices and ensures that together we can continue to fight for a justice system that truly serves everyone. The room remained tense as Kendrick returned to his seat, but the ripples of his words had already begun to reverberate. He had made his stand, and now the real work was just beginning. What had started as an individual moment of confrontation had quickly become something much larger, a cause that couldn't be ignored. His words had struck a chord not only with those in the courtroom but with everyone who would soon hear about what had transpired in room 204. By the time Kendrick left the courthouse that day, he knew that this wasn't going to be something that would fade away. He had done what few others would have dared. He had stood up to a judge who represented a system that had long been in need of change. But as the hours passed, Kendrick realized the significance of his actions wasn't just personal, it was institutional. It was about a system that had been allowed to perpetuate racial bias, unchecked, for far too long. Within hours, Kendrick's confrontation with Judge Whitman had caught the attention of the media. It wasn't just a local story. It was one that resonated with people across the country. News outlets picked up the story, reporting on the tense courtroom moment, Kendrick's decision to challenge the judge's authority, and the claims of racial bias that had emerged as a result. Social media exploded with hashtags like #EqualJusticeNow and #bias. In the court, with people sharing their own stories of unequal treatment in the justice system. The public outcry was immediate and loud. For the first time in a long while, people were talking about racial bias in the courtroom, not just in hushed tones, but out in the open. Legal experts, civil rights advocates, and ordinary citizens began to speak up, offering support for Kendrick's actions. They recognized that what he had done wasn't just about one man standing up for himself. It was about confronting a deeply rooted problem that had affected countless others for decades. As the days passed, more and more voices came forward. Community members, lawyers, and even former defendants began to share their own experiences of being treated unfairly in courtrooms across Greenville and beyond. One by one, stories began to surface. Stories of black defendants being handed harsh sentences while white defendants received leniency. Of late arrivals being dismissed with a simple apology while others were fined or reprimanded. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern, one that had long been ignored by those in power. Kendrick had set something in motion that could not be stopped. The Judicial Review Commission, prompted by the growing media attention and the public outcry, launched a formal investigation into the practices of Judge Whitman. Investigators began sifting through years of case records, looking for patterns in sentencing, fines, and treatment based on race. The evidence began to mount quickly. Fines for minor infractions were disproportionately levied against black defendants, while white defendants often received warnings or reduced penalties. The momentum was undeniable. The community, the media, and the legal professionals had all begun to rally behind Kendrick's cause. His actions had not only exposed a broken system, but had sparked a movement. The fight for fairness in the courtroom had become more than just a case. It had become a collective demand for justice. If you believe in standing up for equality and demanding accountability from the system, please subscribe. The more we raise our voices, the closer we get to ensuring a truly fair and just legal system for everyone. Together, we can make a difference. The days following Kendrick's confrontation with Judge Whitman had been filled with tension, uncertainty, and hope. It wasn't just a personal victory for Kendrick. It was a catalyst that set in motion a chain of events that would forever change the way the justice system operated in Greenville and potentially across the country. The formal investigation by the Judicial Review Commission was underway, but the true impact of Kendrick's actions was already being felt throughout the community. People were talking. People were listening. Change was coming. As the commission sifted through years of case records, the findings were stark. They revealed what Kendrick had already suspected, a deeply entrenched pattern of racial disparity in the courtroom. The data didn't lie. Black defendants were fined at significantly higher rates than their white counterparts, often for similar or even lesser infractions. Even more troubling, the evidence revealed that black defendants were far more likely to be reprimanded for minor delays, while white defendants were often given a pass. These findings weren't just statistics. They were a testament to the lived experiences of countless individuals who had been treated unfairly within the very system that was supposed to protect them. What Kendrick had witnessed that morning was not an isolated incident. It was part of a broader, systemic issue that had plagued the court system for years. And now the evidence was clear. The changes that needed to happen couldn't wait any longer. In response to the findings, the Judicial Review Commission took immediate action. The first step was a public apology from the court, acknowledging the disparity and promising to make changes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The judge who had presided over the courtroom, Judge Whitman, was officially removed from his position, a decision that sent shockwaves through the legal community. While some saw it as a necessary step, others, especially those who had worked under Judge Whitman for years, questioned the fairness of the decision. But for Kendrick, the removal was just the beginning. The Commission's findings also outlined a series of reforms aimed at addressing the systemic racial disparities in the court system. These included mandatory bias training for all judges and court staff, aimed at recognizing and addressing implicit biases that often influence decisions. There would be regular audits of court cases, focusing on racial and socioeconomic disparities, to ensure that the application of justice was fair and equitable. The Commission also established an independent oversight committee that would monitor the progress of these reforms and ensure that they were being implemented effectively. For Kendrick, the work wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. He became a key figure in advocating for these reforms, traveling around the state to speak at legal conferences, community forums, and law schools. He shared his story, not just as a personal account of injustice, but as a call to action for the entire legal community to recognize its shortcomings and work towards a more inclusive, equitable system. Kendrick wasn't just advocating for himself, he was advocating for everyone who had been subjected to the bias and unfair treatment he had witnessed in that courtroom. What Kendrick didn't anticipate was the way his actions would inspire others. His decision to challenge the status quo didn't just encourage legal professionals to rethink their practices, it sparked a movement. Young lawyers, law students, and even activists began to rally behind Kendrick's cause, sharing their own stories of bias and inequality within the legal system. The public pressure continued to mount, and soon the state of South Carolina was forced to take a hard look at its courtrooms and make changes that had long been needed. Kendrick's role in this movement was pivotal. He had given people a voice, a platform to speak out about the injustices they had long endured. He had shown them that one person, one action, could set in motion a chain of events that could change the system for good. His courage to stand up to Judge Whitman had inspired others to do the same. They, too, began to see that they could challenge the system, they could hold those in power accountable, and they could demand justice. If you believe in the power of standing up for what's right and fighting for equality in our courts, please subscribe. Kendrick's journey is just one example of how we can all make a difference. Join us as we continue to fight for a fair and just legal system for everyone. Together, we can make change happen. Kendrick's fight for justice didn't end the day Judge Whitman was removed from his position. It was only the beginning of a long, tireless effort to challenge the systemic racism that had long been ingrained in the courtroom. The changes that had been set in motion were significant, but Kendrick knew that true reform would require a sustained effort. He wasn't content to simply walk away. He was determined to continue pushing for fairness, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unjustly by the system. Kendrick's advocacy for justice soon took him to law schools, community forums, and conferences, where he shared his experiences and spoke passionately about the need for change. His message was clear. The fight for fairness in the legal system wasn't just about one person or one case, it was about ensuring that everyone, regardless of race or background, received equal treatment under the law. His words resonated with young law students and up-and-coming lawyers, many of whom saw in Kendrick's journey a reflection of their own aspirations to fight for justice. But Kendrick's influence didn't stop there. He began mentoring young lawyers, especially those from underrepresented backgrounds, encouraging them to challenge the status quo and question the biases that could often seep into legal practices. He urged them to use their positions to make a difference, to stand up against injustice, and to never let systemic racism go unchallenged. His own example, of standing firm in the face of adversity, of taking action even when the odds seemed stacked against him, became a beacon of inspiration for those who followed in his footsteps. As the ripple effect of Kendrick's actions spread, more and more judges, lawyers, and legal professionals began to question their own practices. They started to recognize the biases in their own work, and many began to make changes. The legal community, once resistant to the idea of systemic racism, slowly began to acknowledge its presence and its impact. This shift, though gradual, was undeniable. Kendrick's fight had sparked a movement, one that wasn't just about holding individuals accountable but about challenging an entire system that had long been flawed. If you believe in standing up for justice and want to be part of this movement for change, please subscribe. Your support is crucial in holding the legal system accountable and ensuring that fairness and equality are more than just ideals. They are a reality for all. Together, we can make a difference.